Hey, beautiful friends, welcome back to another episode of the Robin Graham Show. Friends, there is a lot of discussion these days around burnout, but there are some myths around burnout. And I think our conversation today is going to blow your mind because it's not necessarily that you're just working too hard. It's not necessarily that you're putting too much pressure on yourself. Where is this coming from? The entire mindset that we have to work harder and do more in order to be successful, or we're lazy. The fact is, none of us are probably truly lazy. And we're probably all just spinning in circles doing a million different things because we're trying to do it alone, we're trying to do it by ourselves, or we're on the wrong path. It could be a culmination of all of these things, but today we're going to dive into this very topic. We're going to bust some myths about burnout and we're going to find some solutions so that maybe you can stop working so hard, start seeing more results because you're going to feel better and have more joy and happiness, which is going to ultimately allow you to be more productive, but in a positive way, not the burnout way. Without further ado, Kristen and Erin, welcome to the Robin Graham Show.
Well, thank you so much for having us. It's an honor.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
I'm so happy you're here. So a little backstory. I've known Kristen for a long time. Kristen lives in the same community, and I've met Erin through Kristen. And back in the day when I was doing photography, they were my clients and I got to know them a little bit better. And I've been following their journey, and they recently published a book. And so we're going to talk about that and the extraordinary brilliance that the two of them have and that they're sharing with the world to try to change this, I guess, for a lack of a better word, the hustle culture and where that came from and why it is stifling joy in our country today. So, will you two please tell the listeners a little bit about yourselves and how you got to this point in your journey?
Sure. First of all, this voice is Kristen. So I know it always bothers me on podcasts when there's multiple people and they don't identify themselves. So hi, I'm Kristen. And my incredible best friend is Erin. And I will say how we got here very, very briefly is that we met doing our postgraduate work in Northern Ireland. And we have both been probably like borderline obnoxiously curious for our entire lives. And that is one of the quickest things that kind of brought us together, is a lot of questions of what if and why does it and how does this and what's going on. And like in our free time, we have long conversations about how society works, like for funsies. And so we started working together. I started our company, our kind of division, as a division of my family business back 7-8 years ago. And then asked Erin to join me. And since then, we have been trying to answer a lot of the "but why does it work this way" questions, and how have humans gotten to themselves the point that they are. I'm a sociologist, Erin's an anthropologist. We both have doctorates in those subjects. So what do we do? And so one of the things we have both hated for a really long time is hustle culture. We have both fallen into it. We have both been a part of it. We have both felt incredibly guilty that we can't live up to its standards. We have girl bossed too close to the sun on several occasions. Like, we did everything that Instagram told us to do. And at the end, all it led to was a mental health crisis for me. And a pretty significant one, actually. And Erin's general frustration with this all. And so when we sat down to truly answer, why are we all this way? As we started pulling on those strings and figuring that all out, is when we started to realize that the reason we're all this way is that America thinks burnout is cool. And all of us want to be cool, right?
Yeah, and I think like whenever people ask us like, how did you write this book or why did you write this book? I generally like to blame Kristen for this. And I'm Erin, in case you couldn't figure out by the fact that I am a slightly different voice. But, we've been talking about burnout as a company and as friends for years. And Lord knows when the conversation happened, but I remember Kristen at one point looking at me and just being like, you know what? Like, nobody talks about the Puritans when we talk about burnout. And, she's the religious scholar in our partnership. And so I'm used to these kinds of tangents. And I was like, no, honey, nobody talks about the Puritans anymore. But like, would you like to unpack this for me? And she was like, well, here's my idea. And so, you know, that was years before we wrote the book, and we did trainings on it, and Kristen presented on it with organizations around the country. This idea that the core of understanding burnout starts with the Puritans. And then we sat down to write our book. We didn't know what our book was going to be about at the start. And we were working through the ideas process, and we all just kept coming back to burnout. And the more research we did into people who have written books about burnout, people who make a living talking about burnout, we saw this huge focus on individual solutions for individual burnout experiences. Oh, you're burned out. You must be a workaholic. Oh, you're burned out. Oh, here's how to set better boundaries. It was an individual person experiencing burnout and what the individual solutions were. And it was missing this cultural context of, like, as you said when we started, Robin, like how we got here. And so that's when we really sat down and said, we have to write this book because no one else is talking about not just the Puritans, but then all the things that America added on top of that puritanical base to create the society we live in now, which is driven by, you know, overwork and hustle and girl bossing in ourselves into the sun, as Kristen said, and all of this pressure to constantly be producing things, regardless of the output of those things and regardless of the impact that it has on the person producing them. So for us, that was like the proverbial light bulb. And we were like, we have to write this book because nobody else has.
You know, I'm kind of giggling inside because as a mom and a wife, my husband would come home from work and he would ask the question, and any moms out there listening can probably relate to this, but it would be this, the question would be, what did you do today? And that literally would make my head spin because I'm like, what do you mean? What did I do today? I worked and I did fed the dogs and I took the kids and I did this and made this appointment, blah, 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 blah. The list could go on and on and on and on. But, you know, he had his own things that he was dealing with at work. He didn't have an easy day, but that what did you do today question triggered me because I was so driven and my to-do list was so long. And I just wanted to hand that to-do list to him and say, here is what I did. And it had nothing to do with him being negative or asking a bad question. He just wanted insight into my day. But for me, it was a trigger because I was working from home and the kids were my primary focus. And so for me, that indicated maybe I'm not doing enough. Maybe I should be working outside the home. Maybe I'm not enough. And so as you were talking, that really, it reminded me of that and how, you know, society, I think we as individuals sometimes judge ourselves and others inappropriately as to, are we productive enough? And that stereotype of, well, what does a stay-at-home mom do all day? Well, what do you do all day if you're working all day? You know, and it's like, who's doing more? And really, it's so deconstructing.
I mean, to a certain extent, like, who cares who's doing more? And the answer is
Exactly.
every American, because we're not,
It's none of your business who's
it's
doing
none of your
more.
business.
Yeah.
So to be social scientists for 30 seconds, the reason that a lot of women in particular feel that guilt is that the work, the labor that we do as women, as caregivers, as mothers, as whatever, should be seen socially equivalent as the work that men or non-primary caregivers do, but there's not a capitalistic equivalent. Like, there's not the same capitalistic attachment. And so we don't know how to talk about what primary caregivers do because that labor isn't monetized and therefore it's not measurable. And like, if you can't tax it in the States, it's not worth it. And so what does that kind of do? And it's fascinating. Neither Erin or I have children. And I care for nothing. I have no kids, pets, or plants. And I married my husband because he claimed to be self-sufficient. But Erin is a caregiver, and she talks about quite a lot of that in the book. about what that kind of dynamic looks like. And when I ask Erin about her day, I know a huge part of the narrative is something I'm never going to be able to touch. But how could I possibly look at her and say that that's not labor, that's not work, that's not important, that's not it? And yet for centuries, that's exactly what we've been saying. And so it's some of it right now, like you use the word deconstruction, like we have to unlearn a lot of patterns that we've been acculturated into. And one of them is, like I was raised in church. I'm sure a lot of y'all that are listening, everyone within the sound of my voice, I was raised in Protestant churches. And when I think back to how I was shoved into working in nursery and how not a single boy I know ever volunteered in nursery, like I knew how to change diapers by the time I was 9. That's not a marketable skill for someone who's not going to be a mother, but I was never like in business meetings and things like that. So we've been programmed to do this for a real long time. And so that feeling, Robin, that you feel of like, my work should be valued because like, gosh darn it, it's work. Like I did the important labor of loving my kids all day. And that love has hands and feet on it. And it means I solved 19 crises and dealt with toddler temper tantrums and remembered to take the dog to the vet and all of those things. I did all of that so that you could leave the house.
Mm-hmm.
And why aren't those things equally valued? It's totally, I don't even think it's normal. I think it's good that that bothers us now. It didn't for a long time as a society. I think it's really healthy that we're annoyed by that.
Yeah.
Because the more we're annoyed, the more we'll come up with different solutions. And we have to, I could go on a while, but Erin did a lot of work for the book about the different gendered nature of burnout. And a huge part of this labor that you talked about, Robin, is a huge part of why burnout heretofore has disproportionately affected women.
So
Yeah.
I was going to have you go
No.
back to the basics of where these thoughts come from. Like you broke this down so eloquently as far as like what the beliefs were when the Puritans started this country and how that has extrapolated.
Yeah. So, and I can do this. I co-wrote the book with Kristen, so even though was her idea, I can spill the Puritan beans as it was. But as we argue in the book, the Puritans were the first group of white settlers to really stay in what became America. As Kristen often jokes, the Pilgrims, yes, they came, but they came with mostly alcohol, and then the alcohol was gone and they didn't really like stick. But the Puritans came and they stuck, and they had, the phrase we would use is like their theology, their belief set included 3 things, basically. One, you were a good person if you were a hard worker. And I don't think we talk about this a lot, but I don't think as a country we talk about enough how much we've made hard work a moral judgment and how it is not that way in other cultures or not as strong in other cultures. So they made hard work a moral judgment. You were only a good person if you worked hard. You were only a good person if you worked hard and you did it alone. There were like 2 things in puritanical life that you were allowed to get help from. And it was like quilting and raising a barn, right?
Yeah, quilting and barn raising. Those were the 2 approaches, because you didn't ask for help
building a barn,
and you didn't ask for help. Like even within church life, there wasn't a lot of like personal confession or vulnerability.
Yeah. And then the third tenet of that theology was that rest was for when you were dead. Rest was for the afterlife. And we talk about a lot as social scientists, kind of cultural values. And one of the most talked about cultural value, like as a spectrum, is between individualism and collectivism. So kind of an individualistic identity in a culture and a collective or a communal identity. And we've known this for years, and then we researched it further for the book, but America is one of the most individualistic societies in the world. And when you think about those 3 tenets, it makes a whole hell of a lot of sense why. We are so focused on, you have to work hard, you have to do it alone, and I'll sleep when I'm dead. And whenever we teach and train about this, we always say, with like one of the polls that we do with our clients is, how many of you have said that phrase or heard somebody in your life say that phrase? Oh, I'll sleep when I'm dead. And it's one of those phrases that we throw around without really thinking through what we're saying.
There's a consequence to it.
Yeah, which is what we're saying is, we don't deserve to rest. We don't deserve to slow down. We don't deserve to take a break. We haven't earned it, because we can only earn it by working hard, and we have to work hard until we die, and then we will have earned rest. Like, the level of toxicity in that thought for something that is a throwaway comment for so many people is really, really damaging. And that is the core of America's culture of burnout, is those three kind of pillars. And then we added on top of that a lot of stuff: capitalism, industrial revolution, like everything we have done as a country since then. You can view through that lens and see how it shaped what we got to in the 21st century now.
And to
It's
add the
interesting.
kind of,
Oh, go ahead, Kristen.
I was going to say, to kind of add the modern theology piece of that, which we don't talk about a lot, but I get to talk about here, is that this is the tension. So the Puritans lived what was classically considered Calvinist theology. There's a lot of debate as to whether John Calvin would have recognized their theology at all. But they were very that. And then this is what led to kind of eventually the Congregationalist church, for anyone trying to do maps of Protestant denominations in your head. That's kind of where that came from. A lot of the other denominations, Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist, came at different, much later. So there's all of this. And what really kind of boggles my mind, and what I think, honestly, it's because we've never stopped to think about it, is that this is the kind of thing that a lot of churches have just inherited without ever, and congregations and denominations, and I've traveled the world and I see this a lot of places, is this idea that Jesus called us to work really hard. And like, I've read the whole New Testament in a couple languages, and let me tell you, the closest thing is love and abundance. And so how do we live a life of love and abundance when we've been told to work ourselves to the bone and wait until heaven to rest? There's some things we're really missing in this bit. And this is where American Christianity gets really, really toxic, because we think that God has called us to exhaustion. And there is absolutely no scriptural, or the early church fathers, there's no evidence that that's what anyone actually believes until we hit this kind of business. So as you're listening to this, and as you're thinking through your own kind of how you see the world, I would gently remind you that burnout is not something that God wants for you.
Mm-mm. He rested, right? I
All
mean,
the
we
time.
learned the very first,
really clearly, like,
right?
Jesus
the
took
Sabbath
naps.
day.
He went to parties, like,
Yeah.
you know,
I
He
mean,
had
it's all,
dinner with his friends, like,
he hung
yeah.
out. I mean, there's a whole beautiful thing that about exactly what Sabbath means that I get into sometimes. And the whole thing of it is to cease creating things so that you remember who you are. And like the early, like those who were writing the Torah, they knew we were going to forget that a lot. Like they got that we were going to forget that we were delightful little humans who were really important but not imperative. So they wanted us to build it into a schedule. And now American Christianity has made that mostly the busiest day of our week.
yeah.
So again, a lot of this is deconstructing. A lot of it is figuring this out. A lot of it is like going through the anger of like, I have wasted this many years thinking the wrong thing. It's, you got to grieve this thing that you've been told was correct, and the years that you lost to this system. You got to grieve that. You just gotta, but don't let that paralyze you from creating a new and abundant life that says, not only do I deserve rest, because Erin's right, we tell ourselves we haven't earned it yet. Not only do I deserve rest, but it is mandatory to my existence.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So you guys have your R's, your solutions. Will you share those with us? And I
Sure, yeah.
realize this is a problem that has to be addressed from the top down at some point, because if we continue pushing people, and I think more towards like corporate structure and the work week and things like that, but as entrepreneurs it's true too, because we're alone. And I think, before we started recording, we talked about that, and how, and Erin, you mentioned it too, with the Puritans' belief that you do it by yourself. The more we try to do things alone, first of all, the longer it's going to take. Second of all, the more likely we are to get exhausted and become burnt out and discouraged and unhappy. So there's so many ways that you can look at this from both the corporate as well as the entrepreneurial world. But I think because most of the people in the audience are Christian entrepreneurs, it's imperative that we start to reframe our thoughts and give ourselves the grace to rest, but also to recognize that we aren't meant to do this alone, and we're going to go a lot farther together than we would by ourselves, and we'll get there faster.
Yeah. And I think, the point about kind of the entrepreneurial mindset is so important to make, not just for your audience, but just in general, because you talked about at the beginning, kind of, we're going to be myth busting burnout, and like we love to myth bust. That's like what Kristen and I like do professionally and personally. It's just like, how can we figure this out? And we found ourselves doing a lot of myth busting throughout the arguments we were making in the book. And one of the more random sections of the book that I never thought I was going to write was talking about like the myth of pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. Like, we all have that phrase, right? We know that phrase culturally. We award people for it with these like heroic tales of individual success, entrepreneurship, whatever you want to call it. And we did some digging into that phrase and actually found out that like it's an impossibility. And it was first used in our society to reference something that was impossible to do. You can't actually pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Like, actually, it's physically impossible. And it used to mean that when you would say that, you'd be like, oh yeah, fly me to the moon, like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, like an impossibility. And then it shifted culturally as we became more ingrained in kind of American capitalism to mean something you should be able to do for yourself, to prove that you are a good person, to prove that you are a moral person of good standing. And so when you think about that, the pressure that puts on entrepreneurs to succeed by themselves, as you said, Robin, like, we have to do it together. Like, you can't do it by yourself. But our whole cultural messaging is that you have to do it by yourself or it's not really a success. And we know these like individual kind of heroic success stories that we tell as a culture. Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, like all of these kind of big names. We tell them as if they were on their own. But Steve Jobs never said he did it by himself. Like, if you read any book about him, you will find that he was not alone in his garage in the 1980s. Like, he always had people helping him. But we reward this idea so much that we craft people's stories to fit that narrative of an individual person reaching this level of success. And so, yeah, I mean, the 4 R's are important regardless of where you work or how you work, whether it's paid or unpaid labor. They apply to anyone, because wherever you are and however you work in society, you're fighting against these cultural ideas.
The 4 R's are, the first one is rest. And this is the one that this is the one I pushed back on a lot. I'll be really honest, because every single book talks about the way you cure burnout is to sleep. or to rest or to things like that. And I have hypomanic bipolar. And so resting is really challenging. This isn't just a like take a nap or take a day off. Like this one is actually the one I have to work the hardest on of the 4 R's. But there's some really like for people who don't have my brain, a couple quick things like do a sleep study, buy the fancy pillow. Like you do actually need to stop as much as that annoys me. And like I'm working through that literally with a therapist. You have to stop. Your body can't function. And so sleeping is like we have so many friends that like make jokes about insomnia, and I'm certainly one of them. There's a meme that someone sent me once that says, "Do I have insomnia or do I have a good book and no respect for tomorrow?" And like, you know, that's that. But in all reality, you got to sleep. So if sleeping's hard for you or someone has ever told you that you've snored, get a sleep study. Figure out if your body doesn't let you sleep. So the next one besides rest is rejuvenation. And this is the one that as I thought about working my burnout, this has always bugged me that wasn't part of other people's, because what rejuvenation means is joy. You cannot prevent or recover from burnout without joy. So you find the things that make you happy. Happiness is a non-negotiable entity in your life. These are not things that you shove at the end of your day or the end of your life or the end of your month. And it's like, well, hey, I get to have a little treat because I did all this work. Like, no, like you got to make sure that that's part of it too. So I have a friend who literally writes everything on her to-do list down to like clean her, you know, like brush her teeth, take a shower. Like she has to have everything down for her own particular need to see the world the way she sees it. And she puts down like when she's going to have a little treat for herself, and when she's going to do something in the middle of the day that makes her happy, and when she's going to take that break to walk her dog because it makes her feel really, really good. Like that's all really, really scheduled. Then there's bigger things. I love Disney. So I go a lot because that's one of the ways that I reconnect, which is another R, but it's one of the ways that I remember that joy is non-negotiable. So the third one I've already kind of touched on, which is realignment. And when I talk to people who have a deep faith system, this is actually one of the ones that's hardest, because we are told a lot who we are in Christ or in whatever. We're said that this is how you practice your faith. You need a quiet time. You need all of these things. You've got to do all of this. And we're not often encouraged to find the way that we realign the best on our own level. But what we need to do on a regular basis, routine basis, is to figure out practices that remind us that we are loved, we are important, but we are not imperative to the turning of the planet. That the tides will come in without us, that our kids will probably figure out how to feed themselves if they're over the age of 4. Like there are more solutions than you think there are to reconnect to the fact that you are a piece and not the only piece. And if the thing that your congregation or your mentor or your pastor has told you this is what should help you do it, if it's not working, it's not working. There's no shame there. Find something else that helps you realign. If it's standing by the ocean or taking a walk on the beach, amazing. God is everywhere. Everywhere. So is your realignment. And the fourth one is reconnection, which we've already talked about quite frequently, is that you cannot do any of this alone. Biochemically, we cannot function alone. We remind everybody when we do training that solitary confinement is considered cruel and unusual punishment. Like we cannot function alone. And like, there's a lot of people that are listening to this and they're like, well, I don't function alone. I have a spouse or I have friends or I have all of these. And I'm like, cool. Do a quick mental inventory of how many of them know what's hard for you right now. How many of them are aware of the things that's keeping you up at night? I'm not talking about being in proximity with people. I'm talking about being in covenantal relationships with them. I'm talking about really reconnecting with people to really do the work. The proximity stuff is really important too. Like, who do you do bar trivia with on a Tuesday night? That's all really important too. But in terms of like burnout prevention and recovery and all of that, and these 4 R's, I am an extrovert. I have a ton of friends and I'm so grateful for all of them, but very few of them count for this. like Erin is one. If I feel disconnected from Erin, burnout comes at me a lot faster. And like that's the kind of, and I mean, like my husband too, but he's not here and he can't speak for himself. So but like that's what we're talking about. So it's rest, rejuvenation, realignment, and reconnection. And working those four things, they are disciplines, they are practices, they are not destinations. They are things you do all the time to calibrate, the constant dance of calibrating your life around it. And this is where the word balance comes in. And I would like to throw it over to Erin to describe what balance is, because this is her idea and I love it.
Yeah, it's technically not my idea. It's my yoga instructor's concept of balance. But balance is a huge part of our book because we argue that, we have to shift from a culture of burnout to a culture of balance. And I do practice yoga, and I have for 10 years. And during the pandemic, we had to go all online for teaching, and I was taking a Zoom class in my house, and we were doing a balance pose. And my teacher said to us, because people were falling over, as everyone always does in balance poses, but they don't show you those pictures online when you're Googling yoga poses. And she said, like, balance is a controlled wobble. Like, balance does not mean no movement. Like, what are you doing when you're trying to balance? You're strengthening your position, you're learning, you're figuring out what your body is telling you, you're listening to your body. You're tweaking to try and find, what muscles you need to use in order to maintain that action. And so it's, the act of balance is movement. And we will always all fall over. And like one of the gifts that yoga gave me was the concept that to kind of find joy in that. And, my first yoga class and subsequent teachers I felt like this great pressure to be really good at the poses, right? Like that was my puritanical mindset coming in. I was like, I am going to master that. I'm going to perfect this pose. I'm going to do it exactly like I'm taught, and I will achieve something and I will feel productive. And it's taken a good 6 years with this current yoga instructor to kind of unlearn that, like, that's not the goal of this. The goal of this is not to reach an end point. Balance is not an end point where then forever and ever for the rest of my life, I will be balanced in that pose. Because my body is different every day. My mind is different every day. I have different things going on in my life. And so balance is a practice. Falling out of balance is a part of that. It is normal. It is expected. And as Kristen was going through the R's, and like we do this in the book, we each kind of go through our own R's as an exercise to show our readers that the 4 R's look very different for us. And so one of the things that we always tell our clients is that, you have to figure out what works for you. And you have to be willing to try things and fail at them. You have to be willing to work against kind of the pressure that comes at us specifically as women from kind of what we call in the book the wellness industrial complex, which is basically all of these entities telling us the one thing we have to do to fix ourselves. Oh, if you just try this protein shake, oh, if you just buy this weight loss pill, or you do this exercise routine, then you will feel better. You will be well, you will be happy, you will be pick a feature. And, Kristen and I both fall victim to this all the time. And, we've in relationship with each other gone through this experience. Kristen tried yoga and tried because it worked for me. And I'm sure in her mind, she was like, well, if it works for Erin, it should work for me. Like it doesn't. She hates it.
I do.
So she stopped.
True story.
So she stopped and she found something else. She found Pilates. She loves Pilates. Pilates is not for me. So like, we have to be able to experiment and find what works for us, because everybody's body is different. Everybody's time is different. Relationships, demands on our schedules, all of that. And so for us, it's that, and that is the work of kind of the individual work. Your 4Rs is definitely individual work, but working through them is also the big cultural work as well. Because the more people we can get to change that mindset, to challenge the pressure that the culture of burnout puts on them, that's the top-down work really happening, Robin. Because it's really hard to do cultural change from the top down. It's almost impossible. It has to be kind of bottom up. Mm-hmm. And so we're just trying to get in as many ear holes as possible so that hopefully we can build enough ground support to really start tackling those bigger cultural issues.
But one of the places that top down does work is if you are a boss and you are in charge of your, so like entrepreneur to entrepreneur, the culture that I create in our office, not only the division that Erin works with me, but the other companies that my brother and I run, we have to set up a culture where the 4Rs are present. And so what does it look like to have a very generous parental leave policy? How do you handle staff checking their email on nights and weekends? What is your language that you use around hustle culture? How do you model these things? Either build them, you can build some of them into your culture. Honestly, please have please have like paternal policies, like please. And also just throwing this out there, if you don't, provide free tampons, because they're just as mandatory as toilet paper. This is one of our soap boxes. But how do you prioritize humans within your culture? Does your team know that? Do your employees know that? And if you are your own person, who are you working with to hold you accountable to set that culture within your organization? What other networking organizations are you a part of that are encouraging you to not be this person, that want you to give into hustle culture, that reward hustle culture? There are a million ways to lead others through this process while you are working it yourself.
I love this so much. And my mind is spinning as I'm hoping you can't hear my dogs barking, because of course they're doing road work outside that, just happens to be the time I'm recording. But anyway, life is life. So I love the perspective of balance and how it's constantly moving. We've had people on the show that talked about there's no such thing as balance. And I believe there is a way to apply balance, but like you said, it's always moving. Today, my balance may be one thing, but tomorrow it may be something completely different. But it's about prioritizing the moment you're in and being in that moment and navigating those experiences with everything that you can to make it right and good and worthwhile. And then tomorrow would be a completely different priority. And it's really not that hard, but it is always moving. And I love that you emphasized that, because it's a great perspective. And the yoga analogy is perfect to demonstrate that.
Yeah,
our minds are always different.
Yeah, I have a friend who's a surfer, and he read the book, and that's his, like, it's surfboarding. He's like, there's not a single moment on a surfboard that you are still, ever.
Ever.
Yeah, and like any time, like, you are trying to do something with your body or with your mind, I think, like, but the burnout culture doesn't want like people to be balanced.
Yeah.
They can't make money off of balance.
Right. No. Right. So like, if we are all just supposed to be like in this never-ending hamster wheel of productivity, like it doesn't want you to be balanced. It wants you to think that balance is an achievable end goal, that once you get there, you stay there. Mm-hmm. Because that's what makes it feel impossible. And that's why people say balance is impossible. Mm-hmm. Balance, as burnout culture wants us to believe it to be, is impossible. But balance, what it truly is like what we have to work for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love how you very specifically say that the 4 R's are work. Like this is not something that you just say because, and I talk a lot about this in regards to my book and anxiety. It's not one and done. This is lifelong work that we have to do. And, I think like journaling, for example, for me is like a great release. It's my time to just get all of my thoughts out. And it's just like meditation. Meditation works for some people. It doesn't work for me. Journaling works for me and it may not work for somebody else. And again, that's that balance. Like what works for me isn't going to necessarily work for someone else. And I think it's important to recognize that. But the most important thing is that it is work, but it doesn't have to be hard work. And you get to pick and choose what is your rest style, what is your rejuvenation style, where are you going to find joy? And this is where even to decrease mental health challenges, right, and to get more connected and more creative, tap into your creativity. That when we're working in our culture, we don't take the time to tap into our creativity, which then ignites so much more productivity and everything else for us. So I think, and then of course the realignment I loved, like, and then the reconnection. And Kristen, I love that you emphasized this isn't proximity. This is like truly deep relationships and who really knows you and who can you go to in a time of need, or who can you go to support in their time of need. But loneliness, we know, is it's one of the leading causes of suicide. So this reconnection is so incredibly important, professionally and personally.
And I think first of all, also the thing that we haven't brought up yet, but that Erin and I are very passionate about saying, is that how you practice your 4 R's also gets to change.
Yes.
So like give yourself grace that something worked on Monday and it doesn't work on Friday. And that doesn't mean that you're a terrible person who isn't working your burnout. It just means that you show up differently. As Erin says, you show up differently to the mat every day. Like it's just who you are. But also the thing about reconnection that I've been thinking about a lot lately as I work my own mental health personally, is the fact that I don't just want these connections in times of need. And for a lot of reasons. One, those kind of relationships are a lot of fun and you get to see yourself. And they bring out parts of you that you wouldn't have. But also when you think you're fine, it's important to have somebody look at you and be like, I don't think you're okay.
Yeah.
And the thing is, like, I respect that you say they're not hard. I want to emphasize often they are.
Yeah.
They're probably not that difficult, but I do think they're really hard work a lot, especially for those of us who are like chemically, mentally unstable.
Yeah.
The decision to prioritize yourself is hard. If you're a mom who has, what's the Martina McBride song, loves her kids and never stops. Like that's going to be hard. But here's the good news. We can do hard things. And the hard stuff is the best stuff, because on the other side of that hard is an exhale into a new life. And you can do it. So when you're working these things and you run up against a moment where it just feels overwhelming, it's okay. You can stop for the day and pick it up the next day.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean
that you
said failed.
that. Yeah, I love that you said that. And I think in my brain, I wasn't thinking like, I think my it doesn't have to be hard statement was, if we allow ourselves to do exactly what you just said. Like we don't have to make it hard.
Yeah.
We can is I think what I was actually thinking in my brain.
That makes sense.
It doesn't have to be. It can actually be what we create it to be, allow it to be. But I think something you said, Kristen, just now is you said the grace. And I think, that takes away the shame of not doing it perfectly every day, or maybe getting out of balance in a day. And so I think that's such a great place to kind of wrap up, because we've covered a ton. And this is, I think, been extremely powerful and enlightening. And I am so just thrilled that I got to have you guys on the show and to talk about this, because it's such a unique perspective. And I learned something new. I didn't know this Puritan history, but this was really, part of this. So of course I'm thrilled because like you guys, I'm so curious and a constant learner and constantly trying to figure things out. So I want to thank
if you had told me when we started our company that I would spend this much time talking about a whole lot of dead white people from the 1600s, I would have been shocked. So yeah,
I would have called you a liar.
I would have said, really? So yeah, it's the curveball. No one sees the Puritans coming. It's the curveball of our content. So yeah,
I love it. It's so funny. I love it. But I'm so grateful you were here. And my heart is full going into the rest of my day. Will you tell the listeners how they can connect with you, learn more from you, just follow your curiosity and how your brains work because they're so miraculous?
Oh, bless. Yes, of course you can. We are Abby Research is our company. You can find us on LinkedIn and under that name. And our book is called The Culture of Burnout: Why Your Exhaustion is Not Your Fault. It is available in Kindle and paperback on Amazon. It will be available in audiobook for audio listeners. You might be listening to this podcast and being like, but I don't read real books. I listen to them. The audiobook is coming soon. And if you want to learn more about the book, you can go to thecultureofburnout.com and it's got all the information you could need.
That's great. I will put those links in the show notes. And listeners, I want to encourage you to, I will link other episodes. I think it might be fun to go through and compare like what you learned here today and how impactful this could be in your life to do these 4 R's and have a new perspective on balance versus just focusing on self-care. Because if we're not doing these things, that self-care may never happen, or it may not be the right self-care. So anyway, I will put those links in the show notes too. So if you're curious, you can go and listen to those. And if you're ready to stop trying to build your business alone, that's what I'm here for. The Academy doors are open. You can always join the Success Without Social Academy, and I would welcome you inside of that. And more information about that will be in the show notes. Kristen and Erin, thank you so much for being here. And listeners, please give them a huge round of applause. Go follow them, support them, and share their message too, because I think it is so important, because God has called us to rest and God has called us to live a life of joy and abundance. And if we are just focusing on work, we're never going to achieve that. All right, until next time, everyone, have a great week.